welcome to another GMing seminar. I am your host for this seminar. I am Jason Bulmahn. I'm the Director of Game Design at Paizo, and I'm the creator of Pathfinder. And today, what we're going to be talking about is how to effectively write, adjust, and run a game for just one player, or maybe two. I think most of this advice goes for two players just as much as it goes for one. So I realize that many folks right now are stuck at home, maybe with a significant other, maybe with a kid or two, and you're looking to run some gaming. Now, maybe you got your own game group in the house. That's great. You know, if you got 3 or 4 players, you can probably run most adventures just as normal. I mean, if you have 4, that's our actual recommended number. But maybe you don't. Maybe you only got 1. Or maybe 2 players that are interested. And writing and running games for 1 or 2 players, especially in a system like Pathfinder, requires some adjustment. So what we're going to do today is talk about some of the challenges you face, some of the opportunities that you have, and some ways to make those sessions fun and exciting. You know, you might as well while you're, kind of stuck in the house. So, before we really dig into it, I want to start by talking about some of the challenges running for a small group so that we understand why this is even necessary. Why are we talking about this? So, the first thing you want to think about is, when you're running for a very small group, not all the resources that the game assumes are present. And by the way, when I talk about game, I'm really talking about Pathfinder 2nd Edition right now. However, most of these tips apply to every role-playing game out there. I think some of them will approach these problems slightly differently, but if you're talking about your, standard fantasy role-playing game, and I think we can all name at least a handful of them, most of them are going to have this problem. So, first of all, with a small group, not all of the resources are going to be present. Most of these games assume you've got like a healer and a tanky character and a sneaky character and some sort of spellcaster and stuff like that. You're not going to have all those resources at the table. And as a result, the adventures sometimes they're going to have problems running. They're going to have problems solving certain things that the game assumes are solvable by a balanced group of players. You'd have the same problem if you were running a group of all fighters, for example. But it goes deeper than that. When you're running for only 1 or 2 players, the game also assumes there's a bigger balance in the amount of actions. There's something in game design that we talk about called action economy, and generally what that means is how the players best use their actions. Well, this problem is really hyper-expressed when you have fewer players. We often see this on the other side when you're dealing with just one villain and all the PCs. That one villain can sometimes get overwhelmed just by the fact that the players get to do more. It can be a big challenge. That's why we oftentimes say, hey, maybe throw a couple lower level, easy to knock off bad guys in the fight, just so that the players can't focus fire on the one character. Well, when you're running for one player, you have the opposite problem. If you got one character fighting against 4 orcs, they might be able to take 1 or 2 orcs without too much problems, but 4 times the actions being used against the character can cause some real problems. Last but not least, there's another big challenge with running for 1 or 2 players, and this one isn't immediately obvious. There are fewer opportunities for that player to roleplay. And I'm not talking about with the GM, I'm talking about with their fellow players. Normally the game kind of has this ebb and flow to it, of the players interacting with each other, interacting with the monsters, interacting with the world at large. Some of that is now missing now. There's not as many players for the players to interact with. So they're losing out on some opportunities to interact, and as a GM, you need to adjust. So let's get started here with the first part of this. And the first part I want to talk about, this is divided up into 3 sections: writing an adventure, adjusting an existing adventure, and then running the game itself. So, stick around for all 3 parts. But part 1 is writing your own adventure for 1. So the first thing you're going to want to do when you're writing an adventure for 1 is, like with most games, you want to start with the player characters. So you want to talk to the person or persons that you are playing with and ask them to make their character. You want them to do this, or at least give you a sense of what they're building, before you even really write. With only 1 player, you really need to know what they're playing, because otherwise what you write may be entirely inappropriate for what they're going to bring to the table. While they're building that character, you're also going to want to, talk about them, about what level of play it is. You want to know that information. You're also going to want to ease up on them and add, some tricks, some tools for them to mitigate some of the things that they don't necessarily have. So if you're running a game for one, and they're like, hey, listen, I really want to play a rogue. Well, the rogue has virtually no access to healing magic at all. Very few ways to get any healing magic. So you might want to give them a few consumables. Word of warning. For most GMs, you're going to be tempted to be like, yeah, have a whole bunch. Let's cover up some of those flaws. You can do that. I don't recommend that you do. I think you give them just enough to give them some options to solve those problems, but not so many as to remove the need for the thing that they don't have. After all, part of the fun of running a game for one player is actually using their limitations as part of the story. Now that gets me to tip 2. Once you know what they're playing, when you're building the adventure, when you're writing it, when you're concepting it, you want to know what they're playing and you want to take that into advisement. So let's say they've decided to play this rogue, and you've talked to them about building their character. You give them a couple healing resources, maybe something to help them out in a fight or something. A couple odds and ends here and there. Not enough that they can solve that problem. But when it comes time to write the adventure, you're going to want to tailor it to what they're building. You have a unique opportunity here to really tell some stories that you can't otherwise tell in a group of 4. Let's say you want to do, they're playing that rogue and you want to write a heist. It's a perfect time to write a heist adventure. It's specifically tailored to the rogue skills. It allows the rogue to interact with all of the facets of their character, from sneaking to disabling traps to sneaking up and solo tackling guards, right? It really speaks to what a rogue is good at. Running a heist with 4 players is actually kind of hard and doesn't usually work as well as you might think, because there are some characters who have virtually no skills to contribute to that other than stay back, and when things go bad they come rushing forward to help. You can do this for whatever class they decide to make. So if they decide that they want to play a cleric, you can write an entire adventure in a crypt featuring undead that allows them to kind of really make full use of their character. That could have a lot of religious significance, or a story that has a lot to do with their god. That's a great story to tell with just one cleric. It's kind of a terrible story to tell with the whole group, because there's a bunch of characters that probably aren't going to care. You could do an arena bout for the fighter, like if one of the players wants to be a fighter. You could do a hunt if they decided to be a ranger. You could do some weird sort of like hunt for ingredients if they decided to be an alchemist. There's so many stories that you can tell for just one that don't work as well with a larger group of players. So that's the first thing you should think about doing with just one player. Now, once you've started building those encounters and pulling those pieces together, the next thing I suggest is start thinking of a few curves you can throw in there. A few curveballs here and there can really add some spice to this. And this is where you want to force them to tackle a problem that they don't necessarily have the right tools for. Those will need to be designed very carefully, because you're going to want to look for ways that they can innovate their way out of the problem. Or, just solve it with brute force. But either way, this is a way to explore what it means to be adventuring with just one solo character. Now, I do want to stress, though, you have to be very careful with these parts of the adventure, because they can be very frustrating. If it's a character that has no way of detecting an invisible foe, and there's an entire fight against invisible foes, that's going to be really frustrating. Maybe you want to think about doing something else. Okay, let's talk about the fights themselves. When you're writing an adventure for one, and you want to build a bunch of fun, engaging combat encounters, first thing you want to think about is how you balance those. How do you bring those together in a way that makes sense? Easiest way to do that, especially in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and this holds true in 1st Edition as well, is treat the PC as 2 levels lower when determining what makes for a fun and balanced fight. So, 1 5th level PC versus, a 3rd level monster, probably a pretty balanced fight. Probably something, that is pretty fun and pretty doable. But that's where you want to start your baseline, because you want that player to be powerful enough that they can take on a foe by themselves. If you're dealing with 2 players, you generally want to treat them as 1 level lower. But with just 1 player, you want to definitely treat them 2 levels lower. You might even want to treat them 3 levels lower. It depends on where you're at in the level band. If you're talking about, they're going to be, you want this adventure to be for 1st level characters, well, you might want to make them like 3rd or 4th. That way they can handle the combats solo. Also, when you're designing these fights, try to make sure you don't have fights with, say, more than 2 bad guys. If you have to have a fight with 4, make sure that it's an easier fight, that they can, like, really wipe the floor with the bad guys, because otherwise it's going to be a grind. The monsters aren't going to hit as often, and the PCs are just going to have to spend an awful lot of rounds clearing them off the battlefield. So that's how you design a fight. Otherwise, you design them using the exact same rules. You just treat the player character as a lower level when determining what makes a more balanced fight. You can't throw, if you have a 5th level character, if you throw a 5th level monster at them, that's a real problem. Because they are pretty evenly matched. And that's like generally speaking, the game's going to assume that's like a 50-50 outcome that the player is going to die. You don't want that, unless it's like the last fight of the adventure. So, the last thing you're going to want to do is tailor the treasure and rewards to the player, right? This seems obvious, but, don't give the rogue a holy sword. That's not really appropriate treasure. I mean, you can. I mean, maybe that's the story you want to tell, but on the whole, you should be looking for things that they're actually going to want. If it's something that they would normally have to sell because they can't use it or it just doesn't make any sense for them, here, have plate armor, rogue. Yeah, they're not going to care about that. Make sure there's things in there that make sense for their build. It's obvious advice, but it's worth stating. And don't be shy with the consumables. Feel free to give plenty of them out. Solo characters definitely need more tools in their bag of tricks. So feel free to kind of amp those up a bit, and you'll do just fine. So to recap, when you're writing for one PC, you're going to want to start with them building their player character, figure out what they got, make sure to give them some extra consumables to cover some of the spots that they don't have, but don't go overboard. Make sure that they still have weaknesses. That's kind of part of the fun of it. Next, build the adventure around their character. Build something that is suitable to their skills and suitable to what they're good at. Throw a few curveballs in there. Add an encounter or two that they maybe don't have the right tools for. That's going to be really interesting and really fun. Might be the most memorable fights of the entire story. For combats, treat the PCs 2 levels lower, or the PC 2 levels lower. Avoid fights with lots of monsters. Doing a fight against eight monsters is going to be a real grind. Trust me, you are not going to have a good time with that. And last but not least, tailor the rewards to the PCs. All right, so that's part 1. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Now let's go back and talk about writing on adventure, or not writing an adventure, adjusting a module. So many of you probably have a pretty ample supply of modules that you could run. It's going to be your easiest route when, say, stuck in a quarantine. So, you might want to pull out one of those existing adventures and run it for 1 or 2 players. Again, you're going to want to start with the player. Have them make a character that is 2 to 3 levels higher than the recommended adventure. I can't stress this enough. If you're running 1st edition, definitely look at 3. If you're running 2nd edition, 2 may be sufficient. You might want to do 3 depending on the adventure and how it's built. It's kind of your call. There's not a hard and fast rule here, but that's one thing you're going to want to look at. So that's where you want to start. Next, you're going to want to encourage the player, because this is an adventure that has a wide gamut of challenges and encounters in it. You're going to want to focus on classes and character builds that have a wide variety of abilities to solve problems. You're going to want a character that can take a bit of a beating and walk away from it, and you're going to want a character that has some magical abilities to do a variety of things. To this end, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition at least, I highly recommend bards, druids, or champions. All of those might make good builds. A ranger might work as well if you build them the right way. A druid, in this case, makes a very good option, especially if you go with an animal companion. That way you've got something that can take some of the beating for you while you're back there casting spells, healing it, and buffing it. Might make a really good build. But that's where you're going to want to start. A couple levels higher, focus on classes with a wide variety of abilities. Classes that are really siloed and very tightly focused may work if you go 3 levels higher, but even then they're going to run into some encounters that they just can't solve. They don't have the right tools. But there are some exceptions. There are some ways to work around that. And as a GM, you have a lot of tools in your toolbox, especially for 2nd Edition, Pathfinder 2nd Edition right now, to help you out with that. So first of all, you might want to consider some of the options from the newly released Game Mastery Guide to open up multi-classing to a single character. There are 2 kind of options presented in there. One is the dual classing rules, in which you literally just take 2 classes and you get everything from both of them. You take the higher proficiency of everything, you take the higher hit points from everything, and you just kind of merge the 2 classes together. If you do this, the character probably only needs to be 1 or 2 levels higher. Maybe 2, maybe 1. Because they're going to have so many more tools at their disposal. They're going to be kind of good at a lot of things, especially if they take some broadly divergent characters. Doing that is a great way to run a single character. And if you have 2 players and they're both running dual class characters, they definitely only need to be 1 level higher than the adventurer, I would think. They're going to have the edge on all the monsters. They're going to have tools for everything. The only place they're going to run a little shy is on action economy, because they're still going to be facing a lot of monsters that they may not have all the tools for. There's another option in the GMG you might want to consider as well, and that is the free archetype rules. And what this is it says basically pick an archetype, you get a feat at 2nd level to start that archetype, and every 2 levels after that you get another feat to take from that archetype. This is a way to bundle extra versatility into a character without bundling in a lot of extra power. So I would say that a character with a free archetype probably only needs to be 2, definitely doesn't need to be 3 levels higher than the adventurer. Probably 2 would just work, especially if they have the right tool set. So both of those rules work really well. If you're talking about 1st edition, a lot of that kind of still applies, right? You know, you could very easily build a dual class character from 1st edition Pathfinder, just kind of giving them the best of both classes whenever they have to make a choice between their base attack bonus, you know, or you know, what spells they get or what their, you know, saves are. They just take the best of both worlds. Same advice. Archetypes work entirely differently in 1st edition, so you have to figure out how to make that work. So once they've got their character built, though, now the only thing that you have to do after that is look at the adventure itself. Now, a lot of the tips from writing the adventure still apply here, but we've kind of reversed it. Instead of writing an adventure that's lower level than the character, we've had the character make an adventurer that's higher than the module. So you don't have to do as much of that. I see a question that says, what if you combine both the free archetype and dual class? That's an awfully complex character. I mean, you could do it, but I think you might be stretching the bounds of what the character can actually accomplish just because they'd have like 3 classes worth of toys dumped on them. They certainly would have an awful lot of options, but their action economy is going to limit them in what they can do. So, back to looking at a pre-published module and what you have to do to it. There really isn't an awful lot you have to do, but you have to look for the encounters that are at the extremes. So, encounters that have an awful lot of monsters in them, you're going to want to look at maybe trimming that back a little bit. Encounters that are kind of the pinnacle encounters for the adventure, those are going to be really, really, really challenging, because in many cases, being 2 levels higher is good, but those higher threat encounters in a module are specifically designed to overcome character action advantage usually, and as a result, they can be incredibly deadly if you don't have that edge. So you might want to look at giving the characters some ways to get some help in some of those fights. Maybe, you know, oh, they could free some of the prisoners who come and run interference in this fight, and if they do that, then, you know, they don't have to deal with the guards and can just go fight the vizier, right? There's plenty of ways you can innovate your way around those sorts of problems. And as a GM in your planning phase, you're going to want to carefully comb through the adventure and look for problem spots like that. Things with lots of bad guys in them, and fights that are at the extreme for the adventure. So usually the end or end of parts, that oftentimes have like a capstone encounter that's meant to kind of close out the section. You're going to want to take a good look at those. Okay, so to sum up, when adjusting a module, start with the PC, make them a couple levels higher. Focus on classes with a wide variety of abilities. Once again, bards, druids, champions. Something that can do some healing, something that can do some fighting, something that can do some spell casting. You're going to want to look at those kind of options. Next up, open up multi-classing in some interesting ways. Use the dual class rules from the GMG or the free archetype rules from the GMG. The newly released Pathfinder 2 GMG, which has some great tools in it for this occasion in particular. Next, and lastly, look at the published module itself. Look at the combat encounters, and alter the fights that have too many foes or that are kind of pushed to the extreme, because those are the ones that the players are going to have the biggest challenge overcoming. All right, let's go back here and let's move on to part 3. Jamming tips. To put it simply, you run the game pretty much like you normally do. There's some important things to note, though, about how you run the game, what you do during play, that are worth talking about. So one of the first things I would stress is that when it comes to the fights, and this kind of is at the heart of all the problems when you're running a game for just one player of being a GM. The challenge is the GM is now a much bigger part of the narrative in terms of percentage, right? So when I'm running a game for 4, I'll describe a scene, and then I'll go around the table and let everybody think about what they want to do and describe their actions. Some players need longer than others, and as GM, I can just bounce it around. I can have the story be fluid. I can say, hey, what are you doing? And I can focus on a character that's maybe been quiet for a while and get them to interact. When you're running a game for one, You're half the story, they're the other half. That's it. So that's a big challenge, especially when it gets into a combat, because normally you've got players doing dramatic, awesome things, and then another player does, and then another player, and it gets back to the GM, the monsters go. You have to make the monsters kind of really be a more dramatic part of the narrative when you're dealing with one player, because they're a much larger percentage of the fight. Seems obvious, but it's something that's easy to forget. Be bombastic. Have the monsters move around. Have them change up the situation. Like, that instead of relying on the players to do that, have the monsters do it as well. You should be doing this all the time, but in a solo game, it's even more critical. You can kind of ramp off in a multiplayer game, a table with 4 players. You can kind of ease off. The monsters can just kind of stand there as the players kind of do crazy wahoo kind of stuff. You're going to need the monsters to do that too. And I'm not just talking about doing more damage or putting the PCs in a worse situation. The monsters can take more risks. They can do things that are a bit more dynamic instead of just stand there. Outside of combat, you're going to want to, as the GM, add as many role-playing encounters as you possibly can. Have the NPCs be more talkative. Have the monsters be more talkative. Have some of them be communicative with the players. Once again, there aren't 4 players at the table to interact with each other. As GM, you need to provide more opportunities for the player to interact with the world, because otherwise the narrative's going to feel really flat. This is one of those spots that you wouldn't really think about till you're there, but if it's just, okay, so what are you doing? And they're just in a dungeon and there's no one to talk to or anything. They don't even have anyone else to talk to, so it becomes a lot more like a board game really fast. You're going to want to loosen that up by having some of the monsters surrender, have some of them talk to folks, have there be prisoners to work with, have the town merchant follow them to the dungeon. He's the one who hired them and needs their help. Add as many opportunities as you can to interact and role play with the player, or players, I guess, if you have because, once again, you're a much bigger percentage of the narrative. So there's something else that's really, really, really critical for folks to think about. Once again, it's a thing that game designers spend a lot of time thinking about, but most of your average players in their average groups don't. Randomness is now a much bigger problem for the players. In a group of 4, the random roll of the dice, somebody's going to have a bad session, and that's not the end of the world, because everybody else isn't. You have so many dice being rolled that they tend to normalize. The whole table doesn't, very frequently, have a string of bad rolls. But it's real easy for one player to have a string of bad rolls. And in this case, that might be all you have. In which case, that adventure just turned into a bloodbath, because they couldn't hit, your dice might get hot, and down goes the player character. It can be a real challenge in a one-on-one game. So you're going to want to keep an eye on that and be flexible. What I mean by that is, when you're looking at your encounters, when you're looking at your bad guys, when you're looking at how they're interacting with the player characters, you're going to want to think about, how can I let the player off the hook if I need to? How can I change up the dynamic or give them an edge? Maybe the monsters suddenly run away. Why? Because a bigger monster has revealed itself behind the PC. Now the PC's in trouble too, but they can also run away too, and maybe the monster chases the other monsters, right? There's so many different ways you can give the player an out when their dice go bad. The easiest way to do it in Pathfinder 2nd Edition is just make sure they have enough hero points to overcome a string of bad luck. But you're definitely going to want to look at ways in your narrative to make a string of bad dice rolls not a catastrophe, because it is going to happen, right? The kobolds are attacking the player, and they defeat the player. The player drops to negatives, and then they wake up in a cell, right? The kobolds put them in a cell. But the kobold cell is built for kobold strength, not for mighty barbarian strength, so it's not going to hold them. They're going to be able to break out and continue the adventure. Right? There's tons of ways you can do this, but it's going to require your creativity as a GM. And, of course, as was mentioned in chat here, there is a Deus Ex Machina problem with this, in that if you have to do it too much, they're going to feel like the threats aren't really real. So there's a lot of ways you can do that without making it feel like you're just letting them off the hook, right? Bad guys break morale really easily. This is something that GMs don't do enough of, I feel. If you're fighting 3 kobolds and the only good thing that happens is 1 crit that takes 1 down and the other 2 are beating the hell out of the player, those other 2 might freak out when that first kobold gets beheaded by the crit, right? They can run. That's fine. It's not going to really break your story if every once in a while the bad guys flee from a fight that is otherwise kind of going their way. But yeah, that is the big challenge. But there's really no way for you to fully avoid it. Player dice are fickle on the best of days, and when they're only rolling 1 set of them, you have a problem. Now, I've seen somebody mention this in chat, and it's worth talking about for a bit, because it kind of applies to all of this. There are some very simple ways to solve this, which is allow multiple player characters or add henchmen or things like that, right? So, you'd have 1 player playing 4 characters. I don't recommend it because it's really complicated. A simpler way to do that is to add an NPC character or a henchman who's perhaps a few levels lower than the party and kind of a sidekick. I've seen this work to some effect, but as GM, you have to be very careful about it. This character can't outshine the actual player character, otherwise it seems like you're just there playing, the game with yourself and the player character's just along for the ride. That's kind of terrible. That's not what you want. But having a character that's like, this is the pack mule, and he's my local, priest in training, who follows around this barbarian, that can be an interesting story. This is a great role for a bard, by the way. Having like a bardic pack mule that follows you around. He can play some songs to inspire, your barbarian. He's following him along, taking down the story. Right? There's some fun things you could do there, and can provide some healing if things go really, really bad. So there's definitely things like that you can do. That really kind of applies to writing the adventure, adjusting the module, or running the game. Like it's just a thing you can allow. I think I would be very careful about it, because I think if you overburden the player, that's going to be a problem. If you have experienced players and you're playing with 2 players and letting them both play two characters, means you got a whole party. That can totally work. I have seen that work just fine, but I highly recommend you only do that with experienced players. I have a sneaking suspicion many of us are trapped in our houses with inexperienced players. If that's the case, you're definitely going to want to look at some other tricks to make the adventure work. So, to sum that up, GM tips and advice. Remember, the game on the whole is mostly the same. You need to work pretty hard to make the fights more dynamic, because you are now a larger percentage of them as the narrative goes. You're going to want to add in as much role-playing as you can, because, once again, not as many players for them to interact with. You're going to want to keep an eye out for bad strings of random rolls. If the player can't roll a d20 above a 6, they're going to have a real bad time, and you're going to want to start looking for ways to give them an out, or give them a way to change the odds in their favor. And finally, be flexible with your storytelling, right? Adjust parts of it on the fly if they're not working. If the player's really beat up and they need a chance to rest, maybe that next room doesn't have another fight in it. Maybe it's got a place where they can securely rest. Maybe there's even a supply they can find if they make a good search check, right? Be flexible. Rewrite on the fly. This takes some ingenuity on the GM's part, but, you can make it work. Have fun. You're trying to tell an engaging story for one player. That can be a big challenge in what is normally a cooperative role-playing session. But, working together, you can have a pretty good time. All right. I think that covers most of the main topics of the lecture itself. What I'm going to do is we're going to go back to this screen here. And I think what we're going to do is open it up to some questions. Let me get the chat box up so that folks can see it. Let's see. So at this point in time, I'm going to open it up to questions to anyone who's in chat. For those of you watching this on YouTube, this was originally aired on my Twitch channel, which you can find at twitch.tv/Jason Bulmahn. I run Twitch shows every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. and Saturday at 4 p.m. All times Pacific. Normally I'm just running games and stuff, but I do run game lectures. So everyone who is here, hi everybody. I would love to hear your questions about running a game for one, and I will see what I can do. Arcadus mentions inspiration is another good way to mitigate bad dice chains. Yeah, obviously 5th edition has some tools as well that work really well. 2nd edition Pathfinder has hero points, which allow rerolls, which work fantastic. Irish BB mentions that avoid charm and hold person spells when running for one player. I think that's another great piece of advice. You generally want to stay away, when you're looking at your monsters, you want to stay away from any ability that can totally incapacitate one character. The moment you start using those abilities, you are now one die roll away from not having a game anymore. So, yeah, you're going to want to be careful about that. Yeah, I think that's good to note. I think the one thing that was mentioned before about GM NPC companions is a really interesting point. That's probably worth a hair more discussion here in the Q&A phase. Having done games where I have seen a player PC, an NPC that is working with the players, it can be real hit or miss. That character can either be entirely invisible, or it can be the, scene stealer. And you really kind of don't want either one. You kind of want something in the middle where the character is present, helping out, making comments, being a part of the story, but not pulling too much focus away from the players. They have their moments, that's perfectly fine, but they really shouldn't be there to steal the narrative away. Yeah, like Chewbacca, sure. And just like that. And especially if you can do the voice. I mean, if you can do the voice, you're in a much better shape. If you can, yeah, you're in good shape. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and if the sidekick is a couple levels lower than the party or the player and is averse to getting into a big fight, then you're in pretty good shape. Democles has a question about gold and gearing. Do I tend to overgear them? A little. I think I tend to overgear when I'm running for solo, primarily in consumables that help them in a couple areas, giving them a few options in areas for things that they would otherwise lack. So, let's say I've got a barbarian who's going on an adventure by himself or herself. And they are the adventure is all about this barbarian going out on a ritual to become a full member of the tribe. So they're required to go up into the mountains and hunt down a yeti and slay it. That's how they become a full member of the tribe, let's say. And what would I give that character? It might be interesting that the tribe has kind of a scoring system for how well you do. So they give you 3 healing poultices. If you bring all 3 of them back, it means that you didn't need to use any of them, but you have all 3 of them. And you are awarded a certain honor in the tribe if you bring back 3. It's a little less if you only bring back 2. It's a little less if you bring back 1. If you bring back 0, they kind of go, well, you're a member of the tribe, but you get to sit in the back. Maybe you do that, or maybe they also have a potion of invisibility to help them out and avoid one fight that they don't feel like they can take care of, right? So I tend to give them a little bit more gear than normal, but only to help them kind of solve up some problems. But I'm very careful to make sure that I don't oversolve those problems. So for example, let's say I was doing a party with, it's a champion who has some healing capabilities, but it's a little limited. If you just gave that character a big mountain of healing potions, you kind of take away that disadvantage that's floating around in there. So you might want to be a little careful about how much you give out. Just enough to give them an option to overcome a problem. Makes it an interesting choice and less of an obvious get out of jail free card. Would I avoid monsters with multiple attacks? Irish BB asked. No, not necessarily, although I think there are some monsters, especially in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, that are specifically designed to take on large groups of people. I'm thinking of like the Hydra and stuff that can make its head start in multiple directions. Some of those are not going to really be as effective because they're specifically designed to fight multiple PCs. But on the whole, I don't really think you have too much problem with that. I mean, monsters are designed to make a whole bunch of attacks anyway. I think you can end up in a spot where it's really over-actioning the player, in which case you're probably going to have a problem. Let's see. Vampire asks, any advice for finding the middle ground where participants are fully interactive in rules and RP, where one or both manage the rules and adversaries, and perhaps cooperatively determine the plot and story, essentially using this opportunity to mitigate the role of GM and player and play a 2 PC game. Okay, so the thought here is maybe neither one of you is the GM, and you're both kind of playing. I mean, I think that could probably work. I would probably want to maybe have both players, like what you could do is have it be like a dungeon crawl kind of thing, and have both of you spend a good deal of time, like, writing on index cards, chambers and encounters, and build them to a certain level, and have both of you have a certain amount of tools to add to these things, then take them, shuffle them up, take half of them and throw them away so you have no idea what's in there, and then just have them be a thing you explore and encounter. Have, people dedicated to rolling dice for the monsters and stuff, and the monsters always make the best decisions possible. in that you are creating kind of a challenge deck or something like that. I think there are some interesting innovations in cooperative jamming duties that other games employ. Like, playing like 10 Candles or something, who controls the narrative right now is actually very fluid. Sometimes it's the player, sometimes it's GM. They can have bad things happen, they can have good things happen. Those sorts of games require a lot of setup in terms of what the game is about to make that make sense. So everyone becomes invested in telling a good story and are not quite as in it as I need to figure out a way to win. In which case, something like that might work. But that is true. Powered by the Apocalypse and Ironsworn does have some of that. Yeah, that's true. Starfinder specific ideas. Damocles is asking about the Starfinder RPG. I think most of the advice from this adventure applies to Starfinder just as much as it applies to Pathfinder. I think, we've got, a operative, who's, I'm just trying to think of an adventure. Oh, I have a mechanic, a Yosoki mechanic, who, wants to go on a one-on-one adventure. Well, doing an adventure where that Yosoki mechanic ends up on a crashed ship that lands in the middle of an alien planet, and the entire adventure is about them finding the parts necessary to fix the ship, that sounds like a lot of fun. That sounds like a fun filled adventure romp right there. I think mostly the tips that I gave here apply pretty much the same way. I think you might have a little bit more challenge with the rules, but I think the same sort of bits apply. That giving them some extra tools, some extra consumables, making them a few levels higher, or treating them as a few levels lower when designing the encounters if you're writing it yourself. I think all of that would work just fine. Having a Solarian go on some spiritual quest to some asteroid that is tidally locked between a black hole and a star that's slowly going nova, and there's this weird temple to Solarians there. That sounds like a lot of fun. What's there? I don't know, but it sounds fun. Right? There's a lot of interesting things you can do, and I really want to stress that running a game one-on-one is a perfect opportunity to do stories specifically tailored to that one character. That, I think, is the biggest opportunity of this. That is the one thing you really don't want to miss out on. Because doing those sorts of adventures is not as fun with a full group of people. But having just one, and having this be a story about that character, can actually be a really good time. Bubasti, Dread is a great game, and works pretty well one-on-one, to be honest, just because it's a horror game, for one, and when the tower falls, that character dies, so they're very careful about when they pull blocks. Do I have any content generation tools I like to use? Damocles mentions the Deck of Many Worlds that just came out, which generates alien planets. I think that's great. It's a fun tool. I tend to be more deliberative in my adventure writing, but if those tools help you kind of overcome creative hurdles, then I'm all for them. Having tools that randomly generate things is certainly a lot of fun. The new GMG has some, not quite on that level kind of stuff, but has a lot of tools that'll just help you throw something together quickly. Especially like the NPC section in there is super useful. But yeah, you are right. The Deck of Many Worlds could be a great way to determine kind of an adventure seed that you use. For those who aren't familiar, it's a deck of cards. Each card has various components on it, and you don't just take one card and use all the components on that card. You take multiple cards and use individual pieces from each card to generate a world. That's the long and the short of it anyway. There's a little bit more to it than that, but that's basically it. So, highly recommend. Alright, who else has some questions here? We've got about, 10, 15 minutes. Ederanate How hard was it to get a publisher? I'm not sure that's the right question for this one, but I've been working for Paizo now for 15 years, and I started out as the managing editor of Dragon Magazine. So how hard was it to get a job? Pretty hard. Those are jobs that don't come around too often. For folks out there looking to freelance, that's a whole nother chat that maybe one day I'll do a discussion about how to kind of break into the industry. I've given that panel many times at shows, but yeah, I haven't done one here yet. This is kind of new content for me, so at least here. I've done it plenty of other places. So, all right, who else has questions about one-on-one sessions? Anybody got anything else they want to ask? We'll get that in there and see what we got. Thank you, Damocles. I appreciate it. I'm kind of an old hand at running some of this stuff. I started gaming with just one-on-one sessions. Me and a friend of mine named Christopher, and then later on a friend of mine who was also named Jason. We played a lot of one-on-one gaming in my early days. Back then I think it was just the D&D Red Box. So, my poor first character died to a yellow mold-covered dinner plate. You know the one I'm talking about, the one that's described as looking like gold. One-on-one mech warrior, that's a little tricky, especially when you get into mech fighting. That stuff demands that you have a lance. I should note this guideline, this is a good time to bring this up. These guides apply to almost any RPG out there, really. You have to approach it differently. So if you're running, say, a Call of Cthulhu game for one, there aren't really levels, but you definitely want to give that character extra skill points during creation. Make them a more advanced character. Let them test, because whenever you play a game of Call of Cthulhu, as you use things, you check them off and then you test to see if they go up. Give them a whole bunch of free tests to start with. That way they can level up some of their skills and become a slightly better character. Shadow of the Demon Lord has a great system for running one-on-ones. Well, Gixie, that's why I'm trying to give this lecture. Gixie wants to know if I have any tips for an inexperienced GM. I certainly do. The first thing you're going to want to do is start with something pretty simple. You're definitely going to want to start with an existing adventure. That way you don't have to juggle figuring out how to learn the game and figuring out how to write for the game at the same time. So you might want to start with something like Plaguestone or something like that, but you're definitely going to want to give them extra levels. And a matter of fact, if you're inexperienced, you're going to want to give them like 3 extra levels. That way they have a bit more cushion to overcome things, and if you accidentally make a mistake, it's not as lethal to them immediately. So that would be my first major tip, and of course, take it slow. Don't be afraid to only have the first session be an hour long, and then you can go back and say, all right, what about that didn't work the right way? What about that didn't I know? And then then you can come back to it having more knowledge. You might also want to definitely take the tip about making sure that the player character has a wide variety of abilities to solve problems. That's going to be more important in a game where you're less experienced, because they are going to need to make sure that they have the tools to solve some of the problems and can figure out some of those things, because you're not going to necessarily have the know-how to adjust it on the fly like you would normally. So, let's see. Bubasti also mentions Pathfinder Society Adventures. They are really quite good in that they're very short. They're generally designed for 4 hours of play, so you might want to check some of those out. There's even some of which that you can get for free or very cheaply. So they are a good way to start. And some of those are specifically designed for newer GMs and players. So you're going to want to look into it. Irish BB asked, do I think a solo melee character is easier than a spellcasting character? For this sort of thing, I do. Every adventure assumes that there's someone in melee beating things up. There's not an adventure out there, especially if you're running a published adventure, that assumes you're all wizards, right? Now, if you're writing your own adventure, all bets are off. Running a spellcaster is just as easy as running a combat. combat melee-focused character. And that's because you can tailor the encounters to the character. So let's say your player wants to really explore playing a wizard, and you're like, cool, I'm going to write an adventure for a wizard. And what it is the wizard apprentice, second or third level, hasn't quite left the master yet, but the master has decided that he wants to create this grand magic item, and he's going to send his apprentice out to gather some necessary tools and ingredients. The tools can be bought in town, the ingredients have to be foraged from the nearby wilderness, and worst of all, there's a gemstone that is needed, and you're going to have to go trade with the dwarves to get it. You can write all sorts of encounters around that tests the wizard's skills and abilities, especially if you start thinking about it from what are they going to try and avoid. That can be a lot of fun. If you suddenly put a bad fight in front of them, they now have to use their wizard abilities to avoid ending up in a melee fight because they know they're not good at it, which can be a lot of fun. That can be very memorable, interesting parts of the adventure. And it's all up to you. Let's see. Damocles asked if the mythic rules work for one-on-one. The mythic rules from first edition Pathfinder would work pretty well for one-on-one. As a matter of fact, you might not even need to level up the character if you gave them mythic power, especially if you gave them enough of it, right? That might allow them to just go around and raffle stomp a bunch of bad guys. So, yeah, it could work pretty well. Yeah, Andy, you could just have a big trading quest. You could make the character like a bard. You could even do weird things. Like if you were running first edition, they could just be an expert, right? And they're just trying to go around selling their gear to various towns, trying to avoid trouble, right? The entire story is them trying to avoid getting into a single combat encounter. If they roll initiative, they've failed. Could be fun. I think solo play offers a lot of opportunities that we in the game industry don't pay enough attention to. I think these days there's a lot more games that are actually designed specifically to be one-on-one RPGs. Feel free to investigate those and look those up. I'm sure they're perfectly well designed for that. This lecture is more about kind of what can you do for a game that's designed for multiple players when you only have one. But I do know that there are a fair number of published adventures out there that'll work great for this. Bubasti has an idea that the story happens inside of a tavern and each scene is a flashback as they tell the story for drinks. I love that mechanism. I think that's great. I think people should do that. Then they can start each encounter fresh, and each one can be a challenge, and you can kind of ham it up. That could be a lot of fun. Damocles says the modern gaming world needs that. I can't agree more right now. Especially with so many of us stuck at home, with kids, with family members and stuff. Finding a way to find some fun in all this is really what we all need. That's one of the things I love about gaming is that its entire purpose is to bring people together, which is the one thing we kind of can't do right now, but at least not in person. But there's so many tools right now for gaming online too that I'm sitting here telling you how to play one-on-one. You can also just open up Roll20, figure out how it works, and run games with your friends. All they need is a webcam, and an internet connection. So, But gaming is there to provide us all kind of an escape and a way to step outside of ourselves. And I really think that everybody needs that right now. Oh yeah, you definitely don't need a webcam. You can just do it with voice. That's perfectly fine. Yeah, no, absolutely. As long as they got some sort of microphone or something, right? Yeah, you're in good shape. I mean, you can technically just do it with text. They don't even need that. They could just type it into the chat window. I just think it runs smoother if they can actually talk. It takes forever otherwise. That's just me. So, yeah. Alright, if anybody has mush style, like the 70s now, let's not go back there. Yeah, the save or suck things, the sleeps, the hold persons can be used more as a plot device. As a matter of fact, that's a good way to get you out of a jam, right? I mean, there's an element of this of like, okay, well, you know, the bad guys are winning the fight, and the enemy spellcaster throws a sleep at you, and now you're asleep, so they take you, you know, hostage instead, giving you a chance to break out later. Well, Vampire, I appreciate the fact that you have enough celerity. I have no dots in that. I have... I'm a Tremere, so I don't, you know, that's not one that I get. Vampire joke. All right, so we got just a moment or two left here. If anybody has any last question, I will take those. I want to thank all of you for attending this lecture. Assuming that these continue to go well, I'm gonna keep doing them. I don't know what next week will be, but I'll think of something. If you've got a great idea of something you want to hear about, make sure to add it to the comments of this video once it's up on YouTube, or throw it to me on social media. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Instagram. You can find me almost anywhere. You know, / Jason Bulmahn. Bulmahn. Make sure to put that H in the right place, otherwise you're gonna get lost. Happens to a lot of folks. All right, everybody. I want to thank you all for watching here today. I have certainly enjoyed this, and I look forward to doing more of them in the future. If you want to see more of my videos, you can find them. I run them on Twitch Live, and then they get archived on YouTube. If you're probably seeing this on YouTube, you are already at the right spot to find more of my videos. All right, everybody. Thanks for watching. We will see you next time.